so much, Professor Ravindran, for inviting me here again, and thank you all for coming to listen to our talks and our research. My work is, or what I'm going to be presenting today, is concerned with communication security. I got interested in this topic in the aftermath of WikiLeaks initially. And if you recall, Bradley Manning and those leaks associated with the US. And following that, of course, Edward Snowden's leaks associated with the NSA and the GCHQ in particular, which are the intelligence services in the US and the UK. The primary reason why that was such a large controversy was because they were engaging in mass surveillance of its citizens. Not just mass surveillance, but also indiscriminate mass surveillance. So as opposed to someone who arouses suspicion and then becomes a target of surveillance, they were subjecting all of their citizens to surveillance. And of course, one of the motivations of Edward Snowden for when he leaked the materials was that he argued without knowing the powers that are being used against us, how can we then provide informed consent? And we all know that once we know that we're being watched, our behaviors change. Okay. So that's the starting point of my interest in this particular topic. Encryption and so forth goes back a long way. There's some research done into various parts of surveillance. But when we're looking at theory and so forth, the first thing to note is that intelligence services, they operate as a slightly different kind of beast. They don't really fit into our democratic frameworks or our normal way of understanding democratic frameworks. They don't have the same requirements of transparency and accountability and regulation and so forth. Okay, so it becomes a slightly different adversary or beast that we're dealing with. When we're looking at both the Snowden and Manning revelations, what we see that this form of secrecy is actually a, if you like, a operational mechanism to protect the status quo of power. Okay, so they use secrecy in order to reinforce their own powerful position. Okay, now if we don't know what they're doing, we can't challenge what is unjust. We also have research that focuses on, of course, we're all familiar with social media and so forth, perhaps, and the privacy issues associated with that. And there are commercial opportunities both in harvesting user data and also in selling citizens the idea of privacy. So there's a whole range of issues there. There's also literature around focusing on what is deemed appropriate and inappropriate surveillance. So we might all agree that reasonably the indiscriminate mass surveillance seems to be inappropriate because it's targeting innocent people who have done nothing wrong and should have nothing to fear. We might feel that appropriate surveillance would be someone who's planning to do some act of wrongdoing, be that terrorism or other criminal activity. So there is a balancing act to strike here in terms of what how you conduct surveillance, and there's a body of literature dealing with that. When you look at mass media and how they portray surveillance, there's a strong attempt by authority sources to try and legitimize their use of surveillance and their use of power to monitor citizens. Okay, and what they try to do is delegitimize all alternative discourses. Okay, so there is a tension in terms of the rhetoric and the discourse that's being played out. And what we find here, of course, is that the final point here, that oppositional voices are very rarely heard. Okay, so in relation to things like national security and so forth, you very rarely hear anyone who might say, well, actually, I think you're now going too far in terms of the surveillance and the intrusion. When we look at the rhetoric of cybersecurity, it tends to be very dramatic, and it also tends to be fairly simplistic in its portrayal of security risks. We very often hear the kind of, well, it's fine for me, I've got nothing to hide, or it's too complicated, or, you know, I don't need it, and that kind of stuff. Several studies, and I've listed them all there. There's about 4 or 5 studies in the last few years who've actually investigated journalists' use of encryption and communication security. Now, why is that important? Journalists deal with sensitive sources all the time. When you're looking at investigations, when you're trying to hold power to account, very often those people who come to you to uncover that wrongdoing may be putting themselves in danger, and their protection is of utmost importance. And that's not just in the UK, that's across the world, where generally source protection is seen as, you know, one of the pillars of journalistic profession. What happens if you've got indiscriminate mass surveillance is that protection is eroded, okay? Which is why, to me, it's of huge importance that journalists understand communication security and know how to operate it. These studies, what they find is that, for the most part, journalists do not understand communication security. For the most part, they don't use it, they don't understand it, and they don't think it's important. Okay, so that's partly then also, I would argue, reflected in the coverage that we're seeing. Penny has an argument where, which they term the economics of privacy and mass surveillance. And the idea here is that if you cover up the one communication that is within a sensitive source, be that if you're a journalist or if you're an NGO worker and you're trying to protect somebody who's coming to you who are vulnerable, you will draw attention to that one interaction. And the metadata, i.e. the names that you communicate with between you and that person, may be visible. It becomes easier for an adversary to compromise that communication. So the idea behind this economics of privacy and mass surveillance, and Snowden's argued this as well, is that we should all be encrypting by default. What you're then generating is that you're generating a fog, which makes it much, much more difficult for your adversary or any adversary to penetrate and compromise communications, be that a state adversary or so colleagues of mine, they work in Colombia and Mexico, and there's, you know, a whole range of different non-state actors that seek to threaten journalists on a daily basis. So what I'm interested in with this particular study was encryption and surveillance circumvention. So I'm really interested in how, in light of Snowden, how did the news media, how was the discourse around encryption? Okay. So what I did is I took 1 year before the Snowden revelations and 2 years after the Snowden revelations. I took every single article that mentioned anything to do with encryption, be that encryption, cryptology, decryption, and so on and so forth. And I looked at The Guardian and The New York Times. The Guardian and The New York Times were the newspapers who published the Snowden revelations, okay? And of course, lots of other newspapers eventually ended up writing about it, but they were the two key partners, if you like. And as you can see, I focused here on the online news articles. And the reason for that is because when we're talking about online communication security and privacy, where is the space where you would seek to protect yourself? Well, it's online, okay? So my thinking here was that these are the two news organizations who are dealing with this particular issue. They are already identifying it as of utmost importance by reporting on it. how are they then treating it in the space where it would be easiest for any citizen who are accessing those news articles to then make use of tools and start protecting themselves in the space where they would do it. So that was the rationale behind looking just at the online news. And as you can see, I ended up with 1,249 articles. So I was only interested in the news discourse. So I didn't look at the blogs, I didn't look at the editorial columns. I was just interested in how encryption is being portrayed within the news and in the discourse there. I didn't, because the mentions of encryption are very, very scarce. Okay, so they're not very frequent. I had intended to do a framing analysis, but actually what happened is that, when encryption might be mentioned very, very last in a article or not much at all, what you end up doing is you try and look for different methods of understanding, because of course that actual framing wouldn't have framed the whole article itself. So what I devised was a news context analysis, which is sort of closer in a sort of discourse analysis, if you like, where I'm looking specifically at the context in which encryption appears. Okay, and that's what we're going to look at now. So this is the timeline. As you can see here, I think the colors just about come out. Blue is The Guardian, red is the New York Times, and the yellow, which I think is actually meant to be green, is the overall total. Okay. This is the first Snowden revelations, as you can see here. And these are a range of the revelations as they came out. What we're seeing is that immediately after the Snowden revelations, we see a spike in mentions of encryption. Okay, and that's as expected. We would expect this to happen. Okay, each of the subsequent spikes can be mapped onto a particular event. Okay, so LavaBit, for example, you see mentioned on a couple of these spikes was the email provider Snowden used when he communicated with Greenwald, for example. You have revelations about NSA subverting online encryption. So when we think it actually is encrypted, the NSA was able to circumvent that encryption as well. They were creating these backdoors into our communication networks. We also see the revelations around Angela Merkel when she was being wiretapped, okay, and monitored their phone calls. We then see a debate here around WhatsApp and Telegram. WhatsApp is, of course, a messenger service which a lot of people thought was safe and secure, and then the revelations proving that it wasn't, that there was a backdoor into that as well. Telegram then rose to prominence as an alternative to that particular messenger app. And then towards the end here, you have some really, really strong spikes. And what's interesting is that those spikes are to do with popular culture. Firstly, Citizen 4, which is the documentary about Snowden, where they actually filmed when they went to meet him the first time and receive the leaks. And secondly is The Imitation Game, which of course is the film about the Enigma machine and the breaking of the Enigma machine code during the Second World War. Both of which were nominated for Oscars. Okay, so you see when the nominations come out, there's a big spike in talk of encryption, and then when the Oscars are actually taking place, there's another spike in the discussion around encryption. There's another two spikes there right towards the end. One is related to the Paris attack, where certainly in the UK there was a big discussion around the perpetrator having used some form of secure communication to organize or conduct the attack, if you like, or at least that was what was being alleged. The suggestion then was in the aftermath that the government said we now need to have a backdoor into all these forms of encryption. We cannot allow terrorists to organize like this. Okay. And the other one, of course, was Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server, and those revelations in the US, where they were talking about that quite early on. What's interesting is this dip in the middle. January 2014 or December 2013, it strikes me as slightly curious that when we have revelations about intelligence services, NSA, spying on climate change negotiations in order to undermine and weaken the final agreed test, revelations about that did not cause a spike in encryption, and I think that's quite a stark warning to us in terms of what actually seems to be important in terms of what's compromised. So when those kind of things are compromised, the news media didn't seem to care. These are the primary context of news reports. I don't expect you to read all the figures. I'll do some quick summaries. 65% of the primary news context fall into one of these categories. So when we're talking about encryption, it's typically to do with security, surveillance, privacy, hacking, or business. That's where encryption comes in terms of news context. We look at The Guardian here, trying to compare the two, The Guardian and the New York Times. And the only significant difference here is the blue and the red. So The Guardian focused slightly more on communication, pedophiles, child abuse, and piracy, compared to the New York Times, who was slightly more obsessed with the old Cold War adversaries. So we're looking here at China, cyber warfare, and Russia. But those are very, very small percentages. The key take home here is that actually the majority of the news lied in those top 65%. If we then compare, this is just a very quick graph of the top 5 news contexts across time. Okay. All I want you to take from this particular graph is the spike in surveillance, which is the purple, as you can see here. Okay. That spike in surveillance was a direct consequence of the Snowden revelations. However, you very quickly see that shifting onto the green, which is security. So what you're seeing is that the discourse in which encryption is being mentioned in news coverage shifts away from surveillance and surveillance circumvention to issues around security. And what those issues are, they include things like discussion around national security and starting to try and legitimize activities of surveillance, as opposed to what happened immediately in the aftermath, this suggestion of excessive use of surveillance. So what's the purpose of encryption? So when encryption is actually mentioned, what did the news organizations say? Well, what was it for? Okay. The top graph you see here, the majority of the time it was very, very generic. So they just said, oh, it's for communication. Doesn't really, it's just generally to do with communication or information. So if you have some sort of information you want to keep it private, then we use encryption. For the most time, it's to do with data protection. Okay, so they focus very much on general issues around data protection. So that might be a business who's looking to protect their data from theft, for example, or individuals trying to protect their identity, and avoid identity theft and so forth. The second graph is then we're looking at who benefits from encryption. Okay, so in the top graph we see that it's primarily to do with communication and data protection and privacy. It's very rarely to do with surveillance. It's very rarely to do with any military purposes. The second graph, we look at who benefits from it. And what's great here is that actually the news media appears to suggest that citizens benefit from encryption. So you might think, in light of what I've already said, that that's a really good thing. Okay, and I would say on the face of it that is good. However, they primarily use it for data protection again, and they use it for privacy. If you look at others who might be interested in using encryption. You look at media organizations, you look at whistleblowers, and that comes much, much lower down. They're not really suggesting that this is something for them. Okay? If you look at circumvention, surveillance circumvention, so trying to avoid being surveillanced by your government, in this particular case, 3.3%, and it was associated solely with criminals. Okay, so the message here seems to be that, hey, this is great, we have encryption which benefits citizens, but they're only allowed to use it for, you know, general communication or maybe encrypting some files. If you're talking about the level of privacy of surveillance circumvention, then you're a criminal. Who speaks for encryption? So what's interesting here is, who are the sources? So when the news organizations actually do talk about encryption, who are they citing? And that's important because who they cite are part of the primary definers of that story. So they shape how that story is actually framed, the story and the kind of discourse around encryption. And what we see here is that it's primarily private corporations. Okay? What's interesting here is that those private corporations were the very same private corporations that were complicit in creating backdoors into those communication systems. And now suddenly they were given a platform to exonerate themselves from those allegations. The second graph is perhaps even more concerning, because that shows you, the first line says none, 40%. What that shows you is that 40% of the articles only had a single source, which is pretty alarming. Okay, so it relies on a single source. 40% of the articles that talk about encryption. And the second one I've highlighted there is, again, private corporations. So private corporations are both the primary and secondary source, where there is a secondary source, who talks about encryption. You look at the kind of organizations who you might think you'd want to cite in relation to encryption. You look at whistleblowers, you look at NGOs, you look at activists and so forth, and they come much, much further down. Okay, they are not really afforded a voice in relation to this. I started off by saying I was interested in the kind of information that news organizations provided to citizens reading their news. And this is what I found. So what I coded for in my analysis was, when did they actually mention any specific method? When did they mention any specific software? When did they link to any of that? And when did they do all of those? Okay. And what you can see from here is that, well, the big bluish color, for the most time there was no information about specific information about the tools. There was no specific information about how to do anything or linking out to it. So again, news reporting of encryption was very, very generic. This is really quite important because these are the news organizations that where you would expect they might have gone that one step further, where if you're saying that news so that encryption is important to citizens for privacy, if you're saying it's important to combat, be that state or any other form of surveillance, then surely you would want to at very least be specific about the kind of technologies that citizens might use in order to begin to protect themselves. The discourse that I found was steeped in this kind of language. The encryption is perceived as either too complicated, so not only are they not mentioning encryption, but they're also talking about encryption in a way that puts you off. Okay, so they're saying, well, there is this thing called encryption. It could be important for some people, but most people it's too difficult and you don't need it. Secondly, they also associate it with either working for NGOs, humanitarian organizations and so forth, or if you are a criminal. So very often it's associated with criminal activity that lends itself to that sort of sense that, well, me as an ordinary law-abiding citizen, I don't need to do it, because actually all I know about encryption is that criminals use it or NGO activists use it. So what we're seeing is what I term this delegitimizing discourse. It's associated with illicit or criminal behavior, too complicated for law-abiding citizens. And encryption, we should remember, is so complex and so powerful that even in the US they consider it to be a dual-purpose technology. So they view it both as a protective mechanism and control it for export purposes like a weapon. This creates a contradiction, and this is the final point I'm going to make. It creates a contradiction, a paradoxical contradiction, where the Telegram app, which I mentioned, was hailed as, when WhatsApp encryption was proven to have a backdoor in it. They hailed Telegram app as something that we should all be using, the Telegram app, because then we have end-to-end encryption. It's safe, it's secure. And then, so Telegram being described in positive terms. And then Telegram is also implicated where, as I mentioned, in the aftermath of certain terrorist attacks, where the perpetrator's mobile phone has been recovered from the scene, and they notice that they have Telegram installed. So there is that kind of suggestion then that, oh no, Telegram is now an evil thing when we can't use it because terrorists use it. And you have that kind of contradiction in terms of encryption and usage. I term this a communication security paradox, which I define here as a situation where two or more opposing sides are locked in an infinite regress of contradiction. But crucially, where one or both of those sides benefit from the perpetuity of that vicious circle. So what do I mean by that? You have to create encryption in order to protect yourself. Then your adversary appropriates that encryption to commit terrorist acts or crimes. So what do you do then? Well, you simultaneously enhance your encryption to provide even greater secrecy and privacy. And I mean that both on an operational level, so state level, and also personal. And of course they also weaken that encryption by inserting backdoors into the code, which then undermines the encryption itself. Those backdoors can be exploited by your adversaries. Far from suggesting that this is a contradiction, well, it's a vicious circle, it's a contradiction that I struggle to see how we can break out of. What I'm suggesting is that that vicious circle actually aids at least one or two parties of that cyclical movement, i.e. those who are interested in remaining in power. Because in order to protect their own power, they draw on secrecy, that's their operational mechanism of governance, but also it allows them to have that adversary on which they justify that secrecy. This particular paper is available if anyone would like to read it. I've also written at length about manning and whistleblowing in the past, if anyone's interested in that. But that's all I've got for today. Thank you.